Happy Valentine's Day and Flag Day weekend, fellow patriots. On this episode, we discuss how the Conservative Party has released the ads. We talk about if attack ads work and why the Conservatives are doing them right now. We also discuss whether Parliament is coming back at the end of March or if an election is imminent. There's been a lot of news on that particular topic this week. This week, a senior Canadian political commentator also attempted to cancel the phrase common sense. And we discuss what this shows, what we can expect from the legacy media in the upcoming campaign. And we also discuss what Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre is likely to say in his big landmark rally this weekend. And we close off our Flag Day episode with the curious case of why Canada's political left is suddenly embracing our nation's flag when they haven't been over the last few years. Sean, happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day and also happy birthday to you. I don't know if listeners are aware, but this is your birthday as well. What's it like having a birthday on Valentine's Day?
Honestly, it sucks. No, I mean, like, first of all, it's great for my husband because it's kind of do or die for him. He either remembers or he really forgets.
Yeah.
But it's just one of those things where nobody wants to hang out with you, right? Because everybody wants to go have a nice romantic dinner somewhere. But that said,
you get a reservation probably too on your birthday.
It is not easy to get a
Looks
reservation.
Like you got some flowers though in the background there. So
I did.
Right.
He did something very right. I'm very lucky. But he did forget to get reservations. But I had a backup plan.
Okay.
So we're all good.
Well, happy birthday nonetheless. So
thank you. There's a lot to love in Canadian politics this week. I wanted to start off with news that's happening today. Of course, we're recording this on Friday. It's released on Saturday. And this afternoon, the Conservative Party of Canada released a big ad. And this follows an ad that they released yesterday. So our party was out getting busy. And I want to talk a little bit about if attack ads work. Because oftentimes what ends up happening is when the Liberals release an attack ad, the legacy media tends to say, oh, it's great and it's wise. But when Conservatives do it, it's often sort of pushed the other way. So there were two ads. One was a positive ad. The other was an attack ad. Should we have listeners listen to them first?
Yeah, why don't we play them? Why don't I play the positive one that was released here first?
And just before you do that, for listeners, this is Anna Poilievre. So this is she's a phenomenal woman. She's been a longtime Conservative activist, policy advisor. She's also married to the leader of our party, Pierre Poilievre. So this is in her voice.
My family came to call Canada home when I was a little girl. That home was 6 people in a small basement apartment in Montreal. But Canada made and kept us a promise that anyone from anywhere could do anything. That if we worked hard, we could afford a house and a family. That promise is now broken for most Canadians, with falling paychecks and rising costs and crime. My husband, Pierre Poilievre, is working to bring home Canada's promise for our kids and yours, so all who have worked hard can afford good food and homes on safe streets in the country we know and love. Canada, let's bring it home.
Okay, so the next ad that was released is a frame out of Liberal leadership frontrunner and likely winner, Mark Carney. So Mark Carney's had kind of a free ride in the legacy media this week. We're going to talk a bit more about this. But this is an ad that really frames out his record, particularly on his ability to deal with the American tariff issue.
Trump wants our jobs.
We're going to take other countries' jobs.
And Mark Carney is just the man to help him. Trudeau and Carney sold out Canada with job-killing taxes that push jobs south. He opposed Canadian pipelines while profiting off U.S. coal. Carney even moved his company's headquarters to New York, just as Trump wanted. Carbon tax Carney. If Carney wins, Canada loses.
What do you think?
Well, I think it's great that the party is putting out this type of messaging for a couple of reasons. These ads are clearly designed to do two different things, as you talked about. One is to showcase who the leader of the Conservative Party is, Pierre, and present maybe a different side that voters haven't seen. And then this latest one, the one that was just released here today on Friday, the attack ad, it's being framed out as an attack ad, but it's also, this is a piece of information. This is an informational ad about an individual who is, by all accounts, this isn't just us saying it, everybody's saying he's the front runner to become the prime minister here in a matter of weeks. And many Canadians don't know who he is, don't know his record, and whether they like it or not, he's very likely about to be put into the role of prime minister. And so there may be some that look at this type of an ad and say, oh, well, the dark images or the music are negative. But the reality is the content of it is what matters most. And the content is, this is doing what the media and others have failed to do to this point, which is actually ask the question of who is Mark Carney and what does he believe, and start putting out what record does exist into the public domain and the public sphere for conversation. And this is necessary.
Yep.
This is, forget the fact that we're going to talk about this, whether we're going to be in an election or not in the near future. This is an individual who's seeking the top job in the federal government in Canada, become prime minister. We know almost nothing about what his plans are. So we have to look at what he has said and what he's done in the past to try and gauge out what we think might a prime minister administration under him would look like. So it's absolutely fair and not only fair, but necessary to be putting this type of information out there.
Great point. So you touched on something I want to get into in detail, which is Mark Carney has gotten an absolute free ride from Canada's legacy media on his record. And you can just see how they're pumping his tires. They're not challenging him. There's a couple of things that he said that I want to outline, but I want to park that for just a second and talk about what I think is going to happen from the legacy media over the next couple of days. And I also think probably the Liberal Party is going to put their spinners out to say the following: these are nasty ads. It just shows how nasty the Conservatives are. But I want to, for listeners, when they hear that, this is what people should understand. These people want the Conservative Party to not vet Mark Carney. They want him to get a free ride, number one. And number two, they essentially just want the party to defang itself, right? And how many times, Sean, you and I over the years, have we been told, oh, you can't have contrast messaging. That's not polite. But you know what these guys have done to the country is not polite.
I was going to say, we don't live in polite times, quite frankly, right now.
This is, like you said, this is a piece of information. It is fact-based, what that ad said. And if it just as a proof point on this, if you rewind the clock, it is my birthday, so I'll prove how old I am. If you remember the campaigns against former Liberal leaders, Michael Ignatieff and Stéphane Dion, the Conservative Party had very clear, very concise, very precise contrast messaging that went out. And people were like, oh, nobody likes that. It doesn't work. It worked because it gave voters information that the legacy media was not giving to the general public. And it was a clear contrast. Now going back to how Carney's getting a free ride from the Liberals and whether or not this type of information is necessary for the Conservative Party to put forward. Carney had two insane statements over the last week that got no pickup whatsoever. So the first was on, this is actually from I think a couple of weeks ago now. He did an interview with CTV Atlantic and he talked about how he would tax steel companies. Now, keep in mind, the Americans just slapped steel tariffs on Canada this week. So let's play that clip and let's talk about it.
What the big companies are producing, by and large, are not products that we are consuming. There's some element of that, but by and large, a steel company. How much steel are you using these days, Todd? I mean, not as much we used. So anyway, so that's.
How much steel are you using, Todd? Like, just the flippancy of that comment. So here you've got a guy. We're in the middle of a tariff crisis where we know the Americans have slapped major steel tariffs on Canada before, like in the previous administration. They've done it again. And here he's like, well, how much steel do you use, Todd? How much steel? Chuckles and Rich. While talking about putting a tax that the Americans don't have on Canadian steel producers. Crickets from the legacy media.
Right. Yeah.
Nothing. And, again, like this is where the Conservatives need to contrast it. And since I'm on this birthday tear, there's one more just completely disgusting example of this week. So this week, Mark Carney was in Kelowna, British Columbia, which has been incredibly hard hit by the fentanyl crisis. For those of you who subscribe to the Substack, I wrote a really in-depth piece this week about a decade of failed, left of center, far left progressive policies on drugs and how that has juiced Canada's fentanyl crisis. So have a read on that. But Mark Carney was in Kelowna this week and he made this comment about Canada's fentanyl crisis. And I want you to listen to the flippancy of his tone.
Part of it, we got to respect, look, fentanyl is an absolute crisis in the United States. It's a challenge here, but it's a crisis there. And us doing what we can to help them with that is absolutely appropriate. And of course, securing our borders is in our interest as much as it is in their interest.
Well, it's a challenge that's killed. It's not a lot of people. Fentanyl's killed 50,000 people in Canada. We have super labs that are producing enough doses of fentanyl to kill the entire population of Canada multiple times over. We have drug offenders that have been released on bail, catch and release multiple times because of Liberal policies. And he's purposely downplaying and being flippant about this crisis as it relates to the US and as it relates to us. Like, how many people, I think anybody who's listening to this would be hard pressed to say they don't know somebody or a family who's been touched by this crisis. Right. It's like, yeah. It's a crisis in the US, but it's a challenge here, past the Grey Poupon. And it's that flippancy that's not being vetted by the Canadian legacy media that needs to be contrasted with.
Well, and it's almost worse. It's almost worse than flippancy too. What frustrates me about this, and actually is concerning, is that this guy doesn't actually seem to know what he's talking about. And so you've got all these spinners and talking heads that are out there that are talking up his experience and his resume and everything. But when the rubber hits the road, when he's talking about this, he actually doesn't have a clue what Canadians have actually been going through. Doesn't seem to have any idea what the Liberal government has put businesses, has put families, has put Canadians through for the last decade. And this is the guy that wants to be in charge. And so not only is he being flippant about it, he's absolutely out of touch. And what's, I think, frustrating for people is they have listened to the mainstream and legacy media complain for now years that, oh, well, when are the Conservatives going to put out their plan? And we don't like your slogans or things.
Put it out.
And then we continually release plans. Pierre Poilievre has put out plans on the border and plans to address the drug crisis, and the media doesn't talk about it, doesn't look at it. And then they're giving, exactly like you said, this guy a free ride to talk about these really serious issues in beyond basic and out of touch terms and just shrugging it off. They're not paying any attention to it, but they're giving him plenty of airtime to go out there and put out these ridiculous statements, like you said. And so whether he's supposed to have all this great experience on business and he's talking about these crazy ideas when it comes to steel. And like you said, how much steel are you using? Well, there's a lot of companies in Canada that use a lot of steel and are pretty concerned about comments like that.
Peasant.
And then saying, well, yeah, It's just a challenge. Well, say that to some of the families and the communities that have been ravaged by fentanyl in this country. See how they would define it, and see how in touch they think those comments are with the realities that they're living. So it's crazy, and as we come back on the ads, like, it's necessary. It is absolutely necessary that the Conservative Party is putting out this type of information ahead of either Mark Carney becoming prime minister or an impending election. It is necessary for Canadians to have this information.
And that ad was so tight, right? It talked about the fact that A, he's out of touch, everything you just said. B, he was, his multi-billion-dollar company, under his leadership, they moved their headquarters out of Toronto to the US. They talked about how he's talking about imposing taxes on Canadian producers at a time where we need to talk about competitiveness. And it was just such a tight, concise message. Mark Carney wants the Americans to have our jobs. Spot on. So, I think, Sean, I'm sure that the party has got more in the can in this regard. I think you and I have seen the party in different iterations over the year. This is the most professional I've seen the party in a really long period of time. And I'm glad that they put it out. It was a quick response to a change in message, and it was great. So we'll have to monitor that. But no, that was a smart move on the party's part, and it definitely encouraged me. But I guess this brings us to the question of, when is the election going to be? When is the election going to be? We talked about this last week.
Yeah, it continues to be the $1 million question.
I'm not sure. I think that the $1 million question is narrowing in pretty quickly. I think that there was 3 or 4 developments this week that we should probably touch on for listeners. We talked about this a bit last week, but the main one was that Mark Carney was out in an interview this week, and he essentially suggested that he didn't intend to recall Parliament, that he was going to go right into an election. You've got the headline there. So Carney might call election after leadership race concludes. So that to me says that the Liberal Party is gearing up, that we won't see Parliament return at the end of March. I had one listener, Sean, reach out to us. And of course, if you are listening to this on Substack, you can just reply to the email if you have questions for us. And somebody did ask, well, I thought that the government had to bring Parliament back to extend spending at the end of March.
It's a good question. Yeah.
And so they do if Parliament's prorogued. So when they prorogue Parliament or suspend it, the government cannot operate on something called warrants for spending. But if Parliament is dissolved and we're in an election, it can. So just a quick aside on an answer to that question. So in theory, the government could do this. And like we said last week, this also solves a lot of problems for the Liberals. We've had Liberal spinners coming out gleefully talking about how the tariff issue is a miracle for them. Just disgusting, by the way, as a side. It might help Carney out with his ethics screen potential challenge. And to your point on everything we just talked about, it's not going to allow vetting for him to happen quickly, which is another reason why we need ads. So I know that there were a couple contrasting messages to Mark's this week, though.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly, I guess. There was there are other people that are running in this race right now, even though the media tends to be ignoring for the most part what they're doing. So there has been some of the other leadership candidates that have taken a different position on this. You've got Karina Gould, who we've talked about a little bit, who has said that she's not necessarily interested in seeing an election called right away, that there should be some sort of parliament or whatnot that is recalled, and looking at some sort of a deal to be cut there, which is interesting messaging that's coming out from her in that campaign. And it's a bit curious because she seems to be taking odd positions from
at least
the
she's
others.
Taking positions.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think she could end up in second place.
It's interesting.
I think it's not impossible because she's been the one of so Carney's obviously who the party wants to anoint. and coronate. But between her, Freeland, and the others, I think that Gould had the most visible week this week. And where's Chrystia Freeland?
That's a question that the media should start asking on this. Good question. She had all this momentum, all this lead up going into this race, and it has just faltered out of the gate here. It has, and I think, and we've talked about this a little bit. I mean, I think you're seeing a consolidation of the Liberal insiders and the Liberal power coming in behind Mark Carney, and that is really sucking a lot of the oxygen out of the room. But this is an individual that was Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, has great profile within the Liberal Party and within the mainstream media, and is struggling to break through any type of messaging and get any sort of momentum against the Carney machine right now. And it's a bit surprising, to be honest, how badly she appears to be doing at this point.
Absolutely. Like she is okay. So free comms advice to Chrystia Freeland. Team Freeland, why are you not contrasting against Carney? Like, her career is over right now if you guys are not showing a strong second place showing, and you guys are nowhere. This is a guy, if I was in Chrystia Freeland's shoes right now, I would be highlighting how he was the shadowy hand, which he was, behind all of the decisions of the government in the last 5 years, how he was on the Build Back Better COVID spendy train as an advisor in 2020. He has been a senior economic advisor for the party for a long time, and I would be pinning this on him. She should be contrasting, and she's not. It's completely bizarre. And also, she hasn't really taken a position on the topic that we're talking about, which is should Parliament come back, or should we go to an election? It's just I could go on forever on this. Just even from day one, how she exited the party, right? She threw this grenade into the caucus and saying, well, I'm resigning. If I was her, I would have been like, if Justin Trudeau had phoned me and said, I'm demoting you from finance minister to the American trade position or whatever he told her, I would have said, okay, thank you. And then on Monday, marched into the House of Commons and delivered the fall economic statement and contrasted it with Mark Carney. I would have been like, well, Mark Carney did this, and I maybe you guys could amend this. I don't know. But she's just completely lost the ball on messaging. It's really disappointing to see. Particularly, I'm going to say this.
Yeah.
As a woman in politics, I wanted her to be a little stronger, and she's just not there. It's sad.
Well, and I wonder if it is just indicative of how out of touch this Liberal Party and these Liberal ministers have been with what is actually going on, and maybe a bit just naive to what the reception of a leadership campaign was going to be like for somebody who has been inside the Liberal Party here. And so I think there is a bit of a disconnect between what she has been doing in government and then actually when you actually have to get out and talk to Canadians and actually have to try and rally support. And if you don't have the Liberal insider machine like Mark Carney has rallying behind you and trying to push you over the finish line, you start to realize how upset Canadians have been, how much damage this party has done, and there's not a lot of support for it out there.
No, absolutely not. And I guess watching her fail so spectacularly, it raises the question for me, if she's not willing to fight for herself, how could anybody believe that she's willing to fight for the country or fight against the inertia that the Liberal Party has sort of placed the country in? It's really, do you think she's going to drop out?
You know what, my guess, my thought, because she was really pushing for, I think she was talking about wanting 4 debates. She was really pushing for these debates. I think my guess is that she thinks that she is going to just crush the debates, that she's going to come out and do just something that is just incredible of a job.
Debate is not her strong suit.
And reset the whole conversation. And that that is a bold strategy if that's actually what she's thinking, because like you said, like debate has not been particularly her strong suit. Anybody can just go back and look in the House of Commons in question period and see how well she performs compared to others that have been in the front bench there. So not great. And
do you think she's got the money?
I would expect
by that
so.
I mean like the money to be able to pay the full $350,000 deposit.
Yeah, I would guess that she does.
Okay.
I would expect that she does.
I do think it's curious though that the Liberals have scheduled, I think there's just 2 debates, right?
Yeah.
And it's right after the deadline for submitting the full amount of money. So it's not ahead of time. So I don't know. Anyway, we're getting way off track, but Team Freeland, not great messaging. But back to the topic at hand of when the election's going to be. We've talked about Carney. Carney wants to go right away after the leadership. Yeah. You've got Karina Gould saying
not so much.
She wants to go back. Then you've got 2 others in the mix this week that are interesting. And I want to start with Jagmeet Singh and the NDP. Okay. So there's an article that Jagmeet Singh was quoted in, and it made the rounds this week. It was from the CBC, and it said, "Get ready for an early federal election," NDP tells candidates in an internal memo. So in this memo, which was probably leaked to the press, to the legacy media, the NDP are telling their candidates, well, be ready in the next few weeks. But there's a big but in there. But we think this is, we should go back to Parliament in a trade crisis and blah, blah, blah. So to me, I read it as like the NDP begging the Liberals, please reconvene Parliament so we can continue to support you. What did you think? Because I know you watched his press conference today too.
Yeah, I watched his press conference. We've got a clip that we can show people here. Jagmeet Singh has just so little credibility as a leader, because he has routinely said one thing and done another, and not just once. He has done it over and over and over again. So it's just hard to take anything he says seriously or to know exactly what him or his caucus are thinking. I think there are signs that there is not unity within the NDP caucus as to how they think that this should go either, which again, I think speaks to the lack of strength as Jagmeet Singh as a leader. He has, for almost 4 years now, failed to find his footing as the leader of the NDP to put out any particular contrast or policy or anything that would advance conversation in this country. And then when it comes to the politics side of things, like I said, he has routinely said one thing and done another. And so I don't know. The NDP have so consistently lied to Canadians about what they intend to do that I'm not sure how you can take anything he says at face value. So they put out this memo. Maybe they're actually telling their candidates to get ready. Maybe they're not. But I think they're probably looking at it and saying, we have so let control of this election cycle and this parliamentary cycle out of our hands that we actually don't know what's going to happen. So we had better be ready, because we may not be in control of this anymore.
And that's interesting too. There have been a lot of polls that came out over the last couple of weeks. There's one Abacus yesterday that showed virtually no change in the polls, except there has been one consistency among all of these polls, which is that the NDP are losing ground. So I think everything that you just said is spot on. I think that voters are kind of looking at the fact that this party, they need to get their act together if they want to be competitive, and they're not. There was one more person who was out, an unlikely character was out this week talking about whether or not Parliament should come back. And it was actually Michael Wernick, who is a former head of the Privy Council. He was the clerk of the Privy Council, which is sort of like the senior person in the bureaucracy. And listeners might remember Wernick from he was wrapped up in the SNC Lavalin issue. I think he had some words with Jody Wilson-Raybould. But he essentially said that Parliament shouldn't come back. And I really think that this thought that Parliament shouldn't come back is so out of touch, and it's so liberal and it's so anti-democratic. I've heard some people say, and I think we'll talk about this in another clip later on. Some people are suggesting, well, why would Parliament go back if Parliament's just going to trigger non-confidence in the government? Well, that's Parliament's will, one way or the other, right? And it's hard, like, as a parliamentarian, it's hard to talk about that without having functional committees, the tools that we would have to compel information. So at the end of the day, that's my privilege as a parliamentarian that's bestowed upon me by the constituents in my riding under the rules of our democracy. So, it's not like these guys like Wernick who have lived their lives entirely in the Ottawa bubble elite class get to say, oh, well, Parliament shouldn't come because they might call an election. No, I mean, Parliament will do what Parliament will do, and Parliament is supreme.
Yeah.
The underpinning of our democracy. So bananas. I saw that take.
Well,
and I was just
I was going to say,
so
it's my opinion that people should ignore everything Michael Wernick has to say. That he is he is somebody who has consistently had over-the-top rhetoric. He has consistently talking points when he's talking about the political sphere. And for people that may not remember, I think you alluded to this. Like, this is an individual who resigned under a cloud of controversy at the time. And this is an individual who spent considerable amount of time as a public servant, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But my but on that is that these are not qualified individuals to interject conversation into the political arena. They generally don't have a clue as to what they're talking about when it comes to politics and how and when elections should be called and the intricacies of that. They are experts and often have insight into the functions of government and governance and policy and things like that. And you can listen to them. I don't think you should listen to Michael Wernick about that either, because he's not seen as an impartial individual on that at all either. But certainly when it comes to things about politics and elections and things like that, no one should listen to what he has to say. That's my opinion. Should be discounted entirely. And his thoughts on whether Parliament or not should come back, you're entirely right as to you're talking about your privilege as a parliamentarian and the representation of Canadians. I'm not sure why anyone in the media gives this guy any time of day, though.
Well, and as a former clerk of the Privy Council, controversial or not, he should understand that Parliament is supreme and it'll do what it's going to do. If you're going to make the case on why Canada doesn't need an election, okay, make a case for that. I might disagree with you, but to suggest that, anyway, it blew my mind. Like, that's where we're at. And I think it kind of shows this almost institutionalized disrespect for Parliament in certain quarters of the government. But on an optimistic note, I want to close this section on an optimistic note. I do think we're going to be in an election sooner than later. All signs point to that. But there was a letter, and I've got to give a big shout out to, there was over 100 senior Canadian business leaders that signed an open letter this week saying that Parliament should be recalled. And they really made the case for democracy. Everything that we were just talking about, they said in such a beautiful, neutral way. And that gives me hope. And it should give listeners hope too, that, even though you've got these voices that get picked up in the legacy media, and the legacy media has a, pretty leftist bent, there are Canadians who are saying, no, our system of democracy needs to be preserved. And that means Parliament shouldn't be suspended this way. So thank you, Canadian business leaders, for writing that letter. It did not go unnoticed. And listeners, I encourage you to have a look at that as well, too. But maybe we should get on to the topic of where the legacy media is going ahead of a potential campaign. You want to talk about the cancellation of common sense, Sean? Attempted cancellation of common sense.
Where to even start on this? This kind of came out of nowhere, which is unusual because this is the sort of thing that pops up when there's a slow news week in Ottawa and journalists don't have much to talk about. But there's been plenty enough to talk about. So I'm not exactly even sure why this came up, other than, like you said, there's potential election coming and things tend to get a little wild ahead of that. But just to frame this out for folks, there were a number of journalists that came out this week and started pointing out the fact that this phrase common sense that has been used by Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives as they've been outlining their policy plans that they've been releasing, that we've talked about for years, is also a phrase that has been used by American President Donald Trump.
And so ergo, we're the devil.
Yeah. And so they're trying to draw a straight line between one politician using it and another politician using it, and therefore same.
And I think it's really important to unpack this, because I'll back up. Let's talk about who said it first. So
sure.
Political analyst and columnist Chantal Hébert, she's a very well-known Canadian columnist, and frankly, I disagree with a lot of her takes, but she can really lay out a cogent argument. She's respected by people for being able to do that, even if her takes would not be considered right of center. But this was not one of those. This was not one of those takes. So she put out this tweet this week where she essentially was trying to say that, because so it's my colleague Mark Strahl put out this tweet, very innocuous tweet. Common sense conservatives have a Canada First plan to take back control of the Canadian Arctic. And this was on the heels of a big announcement by Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre on announcing military infrastructure in the Arctic. And she tweets out up at the top there, she's essentially saying that because Mark was talking about common sense, that there somehow is a straight line between him and Putin. And that's just, we have to push back. When people talk about misinformation and ramping up the rhetoric in Canadian politics, that there you go. There is case number one. How is common sense a politicized phrase? Common sense is common sense. There was this one Twitter user, I don't know who this person is, but they had a kind of a cheeky little tweet. I don't know if you have it, Sean, where they're like, they were quoting Aristotle, essentially saying, well, Aristotle talked about the idea of collective wisdom of the common masses over 2,000 years ago. So, I bring this up because I do think that the legacy media, we've talked about how they have not been vetting Mark Carney, and now they're trying to expropriate language into their, the liberal narrative, which is so irresponsible and so divisive. And I think that Canadians of all political stripe should push back against that. Come on. It's a little ridiculous.
It's stupid. This is a stupid conversation that we're having. And I think most Canadians know this, and it should be called out as ridiculous and stupid and all of this. And so we're talking about erasing the words common sense. It doesn't get much more ironic than that. It's just, and it's concerning that multiple individuals in the media picked up on this. And like you said, we're trying to somehow equate this with either Donald Trump or Putin or other people. And social media users were having a field day with this because they recognized it for what it is. This is a stupid conversation, and we have real things that we need to be talking about. And if we don't think that the Canadian electorate is smart enough to be able to understand that the word common sense is just common sense, and it's not somehow secret code for something else, then we've got a lot bigger problem. And it speaks to, I think, what some of the conversation around the media in this country has become. And we have seen over the last number of years, there's been lots of polls and studies that have been done on the general public's trust in legacy and mainstream media. There was a Polera poll out last year that showed that consistently trust among all media is down. And I had a graph,
right?
Yeah, I have a graph here. This is a Reuters graph here that shows overall trust score over time, down from 55% in 2016 to 40%
and this is in Canada,
2023.
Right?
This is Canada, yeah. And so you can see that trust in legacy media has declined. And I think, now, is it because of this one incident? Of course not. But it's things like this that add up over time, where people just shake their head and say, this is ridiculous.
I thought it was irresponsible. I'm going to say that.
Yeah, sure. I think that's fair.
You know why? Because we're in a moment in time where Canadians and people around the world are tired of being told that their common sense concerns are somehow ideologically reprehensible by a set of socialists who have created those problems to begin with. And I thought that her comment was so torqued and so irresponsible. It was actually indefensible. And
well, and then you called it out, and then you had other people getting mad at you about it.
I did, but the one call out that I got called out on is actually on another segment, which dovetails nicely into this whole topic of where the legacy media is going with some of their narrative and torquing things up ahead of a potential federal election campaign. So our nation's broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, is not well known for its journalistic lack of bias. In fact, their journalistic standards and practices, they omitted the word objectivity some years back. And they have these political panels now with people like they're not politicians. They're not people who've actually been in office. They're just literally commentators, not even political scientists, right? Talking about the issues. And this one host who everybody knows, Rosemary Barton, she really, like, in terms of torquing things up and taking the liberal message this week, I want to. Do we have this clip?
Yeah, I was going to say we got this clip here that we can show.
Just before you play it, I want to tell people what this is. So she's going to ask a question to this panel, which includes columnist Andrew Coyne and Chantal Ribert as well, about whether or not Parliament should be recalled. And I want you to listen to her messaging and then listen to Andrew's response.
Do you think that this is actually needed right now? And
yes.
But would it be fair for the government to say, you want to bring back Parliament? Great. There's a whole bunch of things we can do, but you have to commit to not forcing an election for X amount of time.
No.
Okay. Go ahead.
You don't own the job of Prime Minister. You don't have a bargaining chip to play of, I'm only going to meet Parliament, I'm only going to submit myself to the people's elected representatives if you give me some guarantee that I get to hold on to power. You only have that power because Parliament gives it to you, because you have the confidence of the House. If you don't think you have the confidence of the House, all the more reason you should be meeting it rather than clinging to power and refusing to meet it. So it is not up to him to be able to strike those sorts of bargains. It seems to be not if we take Parliament seriously. There's a long-term, as I talked earlier, there's a long-term problem and a short-term problem. In the short term, do we need Parliament to pass legislation? Not immediately, no. But we do have a national crisis in our hands, and if this is not the moment when we get together as a community, when our elected representatives get together to voice our fears, to thrash through what we should be doing, to reassure people, to ask questions of those who lead us, if Parliament's not for that kind of moment, then when is it for? Yeah. And so the notion that it should, in the middle of this absolute existential crisis, that the Parliament is shuttered, I think is appalling.
Though, Chantal, the Prime Minister has the right to prorogue. That is also part of his toolkit, if you will. And when he did it for reasons, yes, that were partisan, but also perhaps necessary, because remember, Parliament was deadlocked when we left.
Okay, so I gotta get in here. So you hear that at the end there? She goes, well, he did it because they were perhaps necessary. He prorogued Parliament because it was necessary, because Parliament was deadlocked. That is presenting a liberal opinion as fact. That's what she just did right there, right? She didn't pose it as a question. Like, do you think it was necessary? I mean, it was a position of fact. And I think she did that because that's what she thinks in her head, because to me, that was a statement of bias. And, I put out this tweet essentially calling them out on this. And then I had columnist Gary Mason lose his mind on me. You can put that tweet up there. He called my take lame bullshit take. And he says, as a moderator, it's her job to facilitate different viewpoints. But the thing is, she wasn't facilitating different viewpoints. She was facilitating the Liberals' viewpoints. And I have to give credit to Andrew Coyne. And then Chantal Ribert went on to say this as well. So credit to her. They said, no, Parliament needs to function. But to your point, this is where the lack of trust in media comes from, right? Mm-hmm. People who are listening to this know that I'm a conservative MP, you're a conservative strategist. So we're presenting our viewpoints from that place of partisanship, right? But we're paying the public broadcaster to ostensibly present a non-biased take, and like it's not. And so
anything but, yeah.
The lack of trust is bad. I do think you need strong investigative journalists in Canada to hold government politicians like me to account. But you can't present such an obvious bias as fact, or as moderating, facilitating different viewpoints. And that's why I do think that the rise of independent media, I saw Candace Malcolm launched a new independent media outlet this week. I think that people are going to get their news from other places because they understand, like you can't gaslight on the term common sense. You can't try and say that what Rosie Barton did there was unbiased. And,
and
they're not used to being challenged on this. They're not used to being publicly challenged on these issues either.
And the reality is that Justin Trudeau and the Liberals have undermined the credibility of the legacy media as they've been in government. We've seen studies that have shown that paying money towards these media outlets, to these journalists, as Justin Trudeau's government has done, it fuels concern and distrust amongst the public about the credibility of these news agencies. And so then you couple that with the stuff about common sense, and you see them spouting out liberal talking points, and it drives the Canadian public further away from these institutions, which, like you said, rightly so, are important to the democratic process. But time and time again, the media and the Liberals have done everything they can do to do the opposite of shore up support. They have done all kinds of harm to media in this country, not to mention what they've done to local journalism and all that. We won't get into any of that. But this has been an ongoing trend from this Prime Minister and this government, and an ongoing trend from the legacy media in this country. And I think people are very concerned about what that means going into the next election. And you're seeing that play out in polls. So yeah, absolutely, it's more important than ever to have these independent voices, and that people are getting information from different sources, like your Substack. I'll give the shout out to that if people are wanting to know what's going on in Parliament and they're not signed up there, that they should be, because this is another way that they can be getting news and information directly from their representatives in Ottawa. So people need to be thinking about how they're getting information going into the next election that is going to provide them with that level of trust and accountability, especially since we're seeing this type of behavior out of the legacy media.
I just got a note. Jennifer O'Connell isn't running again.
Wow.
That's interesting.
No, I've got thoughts on that, but I probably won't share them.
Wow, that's okay.
There you go. Breaking news.
Breaking news. Onto the last topic that I wanted to touch on this week, which is so we're recording this on Friday. Saturday, Pierre Poilievre is holding what I think is going to be a major rally. Well, we know it's going to be a major rally, and also a major political speech, likely ahead of a federal election campaign. And I'm excited for it because I think it's going to wrap together some of the announcements he's been making over the last couple of weeks. Big announcements with regard to fentanyl. So, for example, mandatory minimums for big producers of that particular drug. The Arctic announcement that happened this week, and more. I know there's going to be a lot more. So it'll be a big milestone rally, but it's also happening on Flag Day. Sean.
Yeah.
I know you have some thoughts about the far political left in Canada suddenly discovering the Canadian flag.
Yeah, it's been pretty convenient watching them over the last couple of weeks as they trip over themselves trying to see who's going to be more patriotic than the last, which is ironic because, as you've hinted at, there have been a lot of left-wing activists in this country that have done everything they could for the last 4 years to run away from the flag because they think it represents different types of groups or movements or ideologies or things like this in the country, whatever they decide to ascribe to it in their own head. And so it's been interesting watching this newfound level of patriotism for the country from the group of people that have done everything but be espousing these types of views over the last 4 years. And I will say, on just to dovetail on what you're saying with this rally with Pierre, I think this is going to be a massive deal. And again, this kind of touching on what we've been talking about in the last segment with the media. The media has really not covered the level of enthusiasm and excitement that is going on when Pierre Poilievre goes out across the country holding these rallies. This is the sort of thing that you see in other countries around the world. Even just the size of these gatherings. These are halls and arenas and ballrooms and things that are just packed, absolutely packed with people. And this is not something that we're particularly used to in Canada. This is something
Mark Carney's not getting that.
No,
response.
not even close. Not even close. And in the past, you've heard the media talk about like Trudeau mania and stuff like that, but they're not covering what's going on with Pierre at all and what's going on with the Conservative movement. And so I am excited to see what happens with this rally this weekend. I think it's going to be an incredible opportunity for Pierre and the Conservatives to get more messaging out to more Canadians and unveil more of the plan and the platform that they are planning to put forward into the next election. And so, sorry, back to your question. Yes, it has been comical, to say the least, seeing some of the pivot's the word of the week.
Can we show some of these? Can we show some of these contrasts? So
yeah,
on the flag issue. So this is so important for listeners to understand. When you lose pride in your nation, right, you're less likely to fight for it. And the left has been telling people, can you put that back up? The left has been telling people to not have pride in Canada for a decade. So here you've got this Twitter influencer guy. He's kind of, I think he's like a lefty spinner or something. So this is like 2 years ago. He's talking about the tweet on the bottom is talking about how Canadians shouldn't fly the flag because of the trucker convoy in Ottawa. And then this week he's like, no, we need to fly the flag. And I think you've got one more example too, right? Where this is a CBC reporter was saying that he's essentially saying like, oh, the Canadian flag could be associated with blah, blah, blah. And it's like, look, guys, I really think that we are in this crisis of these multiple crises we see in this country, because you've had leftist politicians say that we shouldn't have national pride for a decade. I mean, how many times did the Liberals essentially tacitly say that Canada Day shouldn't be celebrated? And like, look, I've always said this. Any country, including Canada, but we have moments in our history that absolutely were dark times. But you can't throw out all the good with the bad. You should be trying to fix the bad while celebrating the good. And the reality is that the promise of Canada is something that has brought together people from every corner of the world, united in freedom, where, as Pierre Poilievre has been saying, if you work hard, and dedicate yourself, anybody can get ahead. And that's the promise of our country. We should be proud of that. We should be celebrating it. So, I am skeptical about the left flying the flag. I think all Canadians should, regardless of political stripe, obviously. But they have some explaining to do. And there should be some admissions of, hey, we really screwed up by telling Canadians that they should be ashamed of our country over the last year. And then that's so like this year, like when you pull out your flag on Flag Day, be proud of Canada. I'm sure proud of Canada. I'm willing to fight for Canada. But that means calling the left out on that sort of baloney shaming that happened over the last decade.
Yeah, I think I agree entirely with you. I think that it's absolutely fair to say on the one hand, yep, fly the flag, be patriotic. but also maybe take a second to think about why you weren't or why you didn't want to. Like I said, ascribing some sort of motive or ideology or whatnot to the flag, that's on you. Like, that's on you as the individual. And so if you've had a problem with the country, if you've had a problem with the flag, that's a you problem, man. Like, I don't know how else to sort of rationalize or wrap my head around the way that the left thinks about some of these things, because it's just so crazy. And so I do hope that everybody is out there this weekend flying the flag, flying the Canadian true north, strong and free sentiment as we've been seeing over the last number of weeks. And I hope that whatever sort of period of time these individuals found themselves in where they were not finding pride in the country or the flag, hopefully that's over. And hopefully we can move past that kind of a ridiculous debate and something a little more nuanced.
Amen. Giddy up. That sounds good. So I hope that Canadians this weekend will fly their flags with pride, and also download this podcast if you have enjoyed the last few weeks of Sean and I bringing you updates as Parliament has been prorogued. Make sure you click auto download wherever you get your podcasts, or subscribe to our Substack newsletter so we can get through Justin Trudeau's censorship bans, his censorship bills, C-18, C-12, C-63, and get you the information that you need. Sean, did you remember to get flowers for your wife?
I haven't done flowers, but we're doing dinner tonight.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, you better go. It's better. Giddy up. It's time. It's time for some romance.
That's right. Happy birthday again.
Thank you. Working hard for you. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening. If you want even more political news, subscribe at michellerempelgarner.substack.com. And if you like what you hear, be sure to share this podcast.